Federal agents move at dawn, and by the time the sun is up, the phones of some of the most powerful law enforcement officials in New York City are already in evidence bags. According to multiple news reports, the FBI and NYPD searched the homes of current and former high-ranking police officials in September 2024, seizing electronic devices as part of a corruption investigation reaching into the highest levels of City Hall. Staff connected to Mayor Eric Adams were arrested in related actions around the same period. No one named in these investigations has been convicted of anything. Every person mentioned in this video is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. So what actually happened? Who was searched? And what does this corruption probe say about how a city government can come under federal scrutiny all at once? Over the next several minutes, we'll walk through the timeline as it was publicly reported, the officials involved, the pattern investigators were following, and where the case stands today. We're not going to speculate about outcomes nobody can know yet. We're going to lay out what's actually on the record. Here's where the story starts. In early September 2024, federal investigators executed searches connected to several senior New York Police Department and City Hall figures. According to reports from multiple outlets covering the investigation, then NYPD Commissioner Edward Caban had his phone seized by federal agents. His twin brother, James Caban, a private security consultant, was also examined as part of the probe. Reporters said investigators were looking at nightclub security arrangements and whether businesses paid for protection or influence through connections to the police department. Around the same time, other senior officials in the Adams administration, including deputy mayors overseeing public safety functions, also had devices seized as part of what reporting described as multiple, overlapping federal inquiries. I spent a long time going through the public timeline of this case, cross-referencing which official was named on which date, and one detail kept nagging me. This wasn't one investigation. It was several, moving in parallel, converging on the same administration within the same stretch of weeks. That's an important distinction, and it's easy to miss if you only see the headlines. A single corruption case against a single person is one kind of story. Multiple federal inquiries touching multiple officials in the same administration within the same short window is a different kind of story. That's the reason this case drew so much national attention. Now, here's an obstacle investigators had to work around. Corruption cases involving sitting officials are notoriously hard to build because the people being investigated often have access to the very systems that would normally be used to investigate them. Security details, internal communications, city legal resources. According to reporting on the case, federal prosecutors had to coordinate carefully, timing the seizure of devices so officials couldn't be tipped off in advance and wipe or hand off phones before agents arrived. Investigators reportedly moved on the same morning across several locations, precisely to prevent that kind of coordination between the people being examined. Moving simultaneously across multiple targets is a pattern federal agents use specifically when they're worried about evidence disappearing. It's not dramatic on its own, but it tells you how seriously investigators were treating the risk of the case falling apart before it could be built. The searches connected to police and City Hall officials happened alongside a separate but related development. Mayor Eric Adams himself was indicted by federal prosecutors in September 2024. According to the indictment, as reported by numerous outlets, the charges included bribery, wire fraud, and campaign finance violations, with allegations centering on gifts and travel benefits Adams allegedly received from Turkish nationals in exchange for use of his influence, including around the approval of a Turkish consulate building in Manhattan. Adams pleaded not guilty and publicly stated he had done nothing wrong, telling reporters he believed he was being targeted because of his willingness to challenge federal immigration policy. That's the case as reported. It's an allegation, contested by the person it names, and untested in a trial at the time it was filed. Investigators had built a public case against the mayor. What they hadn't yet made clear, not in the indictment, not in the searches of his officials' homes and phones, was how far up, or how wide, the underlying pattern actually reached inside his administration. That question is what the following weeks were about. In the weeks that followed, several senior officials connected to the mayor's administration resigned. According to news coverage from that period, NYPD Commissioner Edward Caban stepped down shortly after the searches became public, though he was not himself charged with a crime at that point. His resignation followed the seizure of his phone, not an indictment. Other senior deputy mayors, including officials overseeing public safety, also left their posts in the following weeks amid the broader scrutiny on the administration. It's worth being precise here. A resignation is not an admission of guilt. and none of the officials who resigned during this period were shown, in the public reporting available, to have been criminally charged as a direct result of the searches on their homes. Officials having their phones seized isn't unusual on its own. Federal investigations do that routinely. What's surprising is how many of them, at that level of seniority, were touched within such a tight window in an administration that had, up to that point, presented itself publicly as unusually close-knit and loyal to the mayor personally. Here's a piece of context that matters if you've never seen how a federal corruption probe actually works. Investigators very rarely open with the most senior person. It's much more common for federal agents to build outward from lower-level associates, financial records, or business relationships, gradually working toward whoever sits at the center. The fact that a search touched a sitting police commissioner and multiple deputy mayors within the same stretch of days suggests, at minimum, that prosecutors believed they already had enough separate threads to justify moving simultaneously rather than sequentially. That's a structural observation about how these cases are typically built, not a claim about guilt in this specific case. What this case reveals goes beyond any single person. It's about how concentrated power can become inside a city administration. When multiple federal inquiries converge on overlapping officials within weeks of each other, it says something about how tightly interconnected those relationships had become, regardless of how the individual cases are eventually resolved. There was another obstacle running underneath all of this: public trust in the police department itself. According to reporting at the time, the NYPD was, for a period, being led by a commissioner whose own phone had just been seized by the federal government, a highly unusual position for the head of the country's largest police force to be in. Investigators reportedly had to be careful about how information moved through the department during that stretch, aware that anything shared internally could, in theory, reach the very people under scrutiny. The workaround, according to public reporting, was to route sensitive coordination through federal channels rather than through NYPD leadership until a new commissioner was in place. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. When this many senior officials in the same administration end up connected to federal scrutiny within the same short window, a few bad actors stops being a credible full explanation on its own, regardless of how any individual case is ultimately resolved in court. That's not a legal conclusion. It's an observation about pattern and scale. By this point, the searches were public, the mayor was under indictment, and several of his top officials were gone. What still wasn't public, at that stage, was whether any of the officials whose homes and phones had been searched would themselves ultimately face charges, or whether the seized material would lead nowhere at all. That distinction matters, and it's the one the next stretch of reporting had to sit with. So, what do you think? When an investigation reaches this many senior officials in the same administration within weeks of each other, does that tell you something structural about how that city government operated? Or is it more likely a coincidence of timing across genuinely separate cases? That's a real question, not a rhetorical one, and it's worth sitting with before you answer it. For general context, and this part isn't specific to this case, it's how these processes work everywhere. An indictment is not a conviction. It is a formal accusation, approved by a grand jury, that a prosecutor believes there's sufficient evidence to bring to trial. The person indicted has the right to contest every allegation, to see the evidence against them, and to be judged only by a jury applying the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Search warrants, similarly, require a judge to find probable cause. They are not, on their own, evidence of wrongdoing by anyone whose property is searched. These protections exist specifically so that public scrutiny, however intense, doesn't substitute for a legal process. There's a detail in how this case eventually moved through the courts that's worth mentioning, because it changed the shape of the story. In the months following the original indictment, the case against Mayor Adams became the subject of an unusual development. The Department of Justice, under new leadership, moved to have the charges against Adams dismissed. According to court filings and reporting at the time, the presiding federal judge ultimately dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled, while also noting concerns about the circumstances surrounding the request to drop the charges. That outcome doesn't resolve, one way or the other, the separate questions raised by the searches of police and city hall officials' homes during the original investigation. Those threads, based on the public record available, didn't all conclude in the same way or on the same timeline as the mayor's own case. Here's a detail that stuck with me from that period. The same investigation that began with simultaneous pre-dawn searches across multiple homes ended, for the mayor's own charges at least, without a verdict. Instead, it got a legal dismissal shaped as much by a change in federal leadership as by anything argued in a courtroom. That's not a common way for a major public corruption case to end, and it's part of why this story is still worth understanding carefully rather than reducing to a single headline. If you've been following city politics anywhere, you've probably seen a version of this pattern before. A wave of resignations, a federal case that seems airtight on paper, and then an ending that doesn't look anything like what the opening days suggested it would. This case followed that shape almost exactly, and that's worth remembering the next time a similar story breaks somewhere else. None of this means the underlying questions raised by the original searches have been settled. What it means is that the public record, as it stands, contains an indictment that was ultimately dismissed, a group of resignations that were never directly tied in public reporting to criminal charges against the individuals involved, and separate investigative threads whose final outcomes weren't, based on available public reporting, all resolved by the time this video was made. That's an honest, if unsatisfying, place to leave a story that started with this much apparent momentum. We cut a few of the more granular procedural details from this video for length, the exact sequence of which deputy mayor resigned on which date, and the specific agencies coordinating each thread of the investigation. If you want that level of detail, drop a comment and we'll consider it for a follow-up. So where does that leave things? A sitting mayor was indicted, then saw those charges dismissed under unusual circumstances. Several of his most senior officials had their homes and devices searched by federal agents, and several of them resigned in the aftermath, without, based on the public record, all of them facing charges themselves. The investigation that started this chain of events was, by design, built to move on multiple fronts at once, which is exactly why the story felt so large so quickly. Whether any additional charges are still possible against any of the other officials involved isn't something the public record can answer right now. What we can say, with confidence, is what actually happened, when it happened, and who was named, and we've tried to lay that out here exactly as it was reported, no more and no less.